you so much, Judy. This was such a lovely and thoughtful introduction. And also, thank you so much for so much warmth and support and just wonderful conversation all year. And thanks to Liz Cohen for her generosity in so many ways, and to everyone else at the Radcliffe Institute for this incredible fellowship. It's been not only massively productive, but also just a really inspiring time. I feel so lucky to be surrounded by fellows as brilliant and as kind as all of you. And huge thanks to Sharon and Rebecca and Murphy and Katie for making the fellowship run so amazingly, and also for having the answer to everything. It's pretty incredible. And thanks to you all for being here today. So Judy mentioned The Un-Americans, which is my first book. It's a collection of short stories. And it took me 10 years to write, and that was like working all the time, kind of obsessively. And because of the subject matter, I ended up doing an enormous amount of research in many countries. And so today I thought I would talk about how I put the book together, and then also just about how one goes about researching and writing a collection of fictional stories, all of which are grounded in one way or another in history. And throughout the talk, I'll read from my book, and then we can open it up into a larger discussion. So I began with this deep interest in exploring this triangle between East European politics during the Cold War, Jewish American liberalism, and the effect that these two things had on contemporary Israel. And so it's no surprise that the stories in my collection move from McCarthy-era Los Angeles to contemporary Tel Aviv to communist-era Prague and back again. But beyond that idea, I really had no idea what themes would connect the stories, or how or even if the whole book would come together as a whole. And the truth is that I felt like I kind of had to keep these crazy blinders on the whole time I was writing these stories, and just not to worry about any of that stuff, and to just trust that once I finished writing, the work itself would start to tell me what these themes were. And that is basically what happened, although it took a long time. And once the stories that ultimately made it into this book were done, and I should say there were so many stories that didn't make it into the book and that ended up like in a secret drawer that I hope no one ever looks in because they're so bad. But once the stories that made it into the book were there, and I remember having them all printed out, and I put them on the floor of a room, and every day I would kind of go in and stare at the stories and shuffle them around, and I was trying to figure out both the order of the book, but also kind of how these were all threaded together thematically. And what I realized is that they weren't put together by a particular place or by a particular voice, as so many of my favorite collections are. They move around the globe throughout almost a century of history, and they're narrated by women and men, younger, older, American, Israeli, and European. But rather, there was this, in the link, there was this underlying question that was just sort of thrumming beneath the surface. And the question was, what are the complicated and sometimes devastating effects that one person's attempts to improve the world can have on the people closest to them? And so that's what these stories are really about for me. So first of all, I'll turn to the stories in Israel. I've spent a lot of my adult life going back and forth between the US and Israel. I used to work for a nonprofit there, and also at an immigration absorption center for Ethiopian and Russian immigrants. And the first connotation that the word Un-Americans has, I think for most of us, is the McCarthy era. But as I worked on the book, I became so interested in this complex meaning that the word Un-American might have to this current generation of Israelis, who are forced to contend every day with their country's very messy but incredibly close relationship to America. So for example, in one of my stories, I have an Israeli soldier who deeply resents having to defend a settlement filled with Brooklyn-born religious families, but still pines for a chance to visit the US for himself. And I also found myself exploring this idea of un-Americanness in terms of privilege. So for example, in another story, I have a working class Israeli narrator who has been living in the US for a decade, and he doesn't at all feel American, whereas his wealthy American wife can just kind of globetrot throughout the Middle East with utter confidence and ease. And so that felt really interesting for me to think about the way that kind of money works into that idea. And so what I wanted to do, as I said, I'll be reading a bit from my book as I talk. And so I wanted to read from a story called A Difficult Phase, which is about a young Israeli journalist named Talia who's stationed in Ukraine, and whose career and ultimately her life is upended by America's most recent economic crash. And I'll just read a couple pages about her life in Kiev. And everyone can hear me, right? I just kind of got up and started talking, so okay, good. So her name is Talia. Here we go. "When are you coming back?" her parents would ask during their weekly calls. They thought she was insane for wanting to report on the very city her grandparents had worked so hard to leave. The moment Talia heard their voices, she felt as if she'd been yanked across the Mediterranean and transported back home. Her father on the porch listening to the radio, her mother always beside him, shelling fava beans or peeling beets, her two sisters chasing after their toddlers while their husbands relaxed on the lawn. "Things are working out here," Talia would tell them, wondering how just having them on the end of the line could make her feel as defensive as she'd been at 16. And the truth was that things had been working out. Talia had wanted to be a reporter since she could remember, and it had stunned her, sitting in her cubicle in Kiev, that her life was actually unfolding the way she'd fantasized. She'd started at the Jerusalem bureau of an American paper right out of college, doing whatever grunt work was needed, filing, fact-checking, going on coffee runs when the intern was busy. But her English was near fluent, and after years of begging and badgering the bureau chief, he finally started giving her work, as if the very behavior that had gotten her sent to the corner as a child was the thing that garnered his respect. It was true, he said, that she was living in one of the hardest countries to find staff jobs. No one ever left their positions at the Israeli papers, and reporters from all over the world competed for work at the foreign ones. But with her language skills, probably the one time her Slavic literature degree made her more employable, he'd lobby the higher-ups in Chicago to send her to Kiev if things got bad enough to need someone on the ground. That was 4 years ago, in the fall of 2004, and Talia remembered sitting in the flickering, fluorescent-lit conference room of the Jerusalem Bureau, watching it all unfold on TV. The election fraud allegations, Yushchenko's terrifying, ever-changing face, and holding on to a shameful, selfish hope for things to keep spiraling. She'd always felt so envious of the other reporters at her paper in Jerusalem, none of them Israeli, all of them cabbing over to the bar at the American Colony Hotel every night after work, as if living out some vintage fantasy. They were all smart, they all spoke the language, many had relatives there and knew the country even before they were hired. But there was something so romantic about the way they saw their jobs, sinking into chairs in the garden bar, press passes still dangling from their necks, immediately launching into thrilling tales of how they were this close to danger that day, before pausing and taking a handful of the free cashews on the table. Even her bureau chief, whom Talia genuinely admired, still acted as though he was playing the part of the daredevil reporter, always driving himself into the territories, traveling with a separate passport through Lebanon and Syria, as if relentlessly performing for a rapt, imaginary audience back home in Chicago. It had always bothered Talia, listening to them debate her country's politics, when it was implicitly understood that the moment their brushes with danger went from being this close to way too fucking close, they could leave. But then she was given the same opportunity, to be lifted from her life and plucked down in a place to which she had an even flimsier connection than many of her coworkers had to Israel, and she found herself guilty of that same excitement. Anyone would have felt it covering the demonstrations, of course. But she'd been just as amped in the months that followed, sitting in the stuffy, windowless media room in the district courthouse, or transcribing at her desk for hours, eating meal after meal of crackers with chocolate spread, as if everything took on a significance she'd never felt back home, the thrill of living on the other side of the glass. I'll stop there. So as I kept working on this book and was working on these stories, I kept thinking about this notion of un-Americanness also for my East European characters. And those characters are dissidents and academics, band artists and writers who risk their lives for their politics in their mother countries, only to come to the US where they have to reinvent their identities and where they're treated as anything but American. And I kept thinking about this really complicated emotional impact that the fall of communism might have had for my characters during that time. Like, what is it like to dedicate yourself to a cause? You know, for these characters, in this case, it's defeating communism, that in the course of world events is ultimately successful, and therefore it comes to an end. And I wondered whether some people might have had a niggling feeling of nostalgia for this incredibly bleak time simply because they held a significant place in it. For so many of my characters, their entire sense of self is shaped by their political work. And I felt like I was spending so much time just trying to understand their political lives. And I wanted to explore how having lived under surveillance in Eastern Europe influences their lives once they immigrate to America, where they quickly realize that not only are they no longer being watched, they're not even being noticed. And so I wanted now to read a couple pages from a story that's in conversation with this idea. And the story is set in this fictional college town in Maine, where a former Czech dissident named Tomáš is teaching. And he has a supremely fractured relationship with his ex-wife Katka and their daughter Daniela. And he has just learned that his daughter Daniela, who's in her 20s, has written a play about their family and that it's going to be produced off-Broadway. And he's just a disaster. And he is massively paranoid and terrified that the play is going to expose him and his shortcomings as a father. And so he strong-arms his daughter into a weekend up in Maine so that he can get his hands on the play and attempt her to revise it. So that's the story. And I'll read a few pages as he prepares for her visit and looks back on these early years in America. And the story is called The Quietest Man, and you can all just picture me as a paranoid middle-aged man as I read. So The Quietest Man. Okay. And so again, Daniela is the daughter and Katka is the wife. Daniela was 2 when Katka and I separated. She was bred on a lifetime of her mother's tales about me. Katka, I imagined, would begin by saying that I was the one who dragged her to America in the first place. In Prague, we had written anonymously with our colleagues for the journal, The Chronicle of Our Time. We wrote by hand. The government had a record of everyone who owned typewriters. And late at night, I'd sneak into different university buildings to type the materials. Every time we finished an issue, we distributed it to people we knew, who then passed it along to people they knew, until we had thousands of readers throughout the country. But when the government still managed to link me to a typewriter, I was brought in for questioning and fired from my teaching post. At the time, Katka had seemed like the lucky one. She was on maternity leave that term and so avoided suspicion. But it was my name people chanted outside the university. It was my name that made international headlines and reached the desk of Saul Sandalowski, the American professor who campaigned to get me a visa and a teaching job to avoid imprisonment. She'd tell Daniela about packing our entire flat in 3 days before boarding the long flight to the States. She'd talk about the brick faculty apartment that awaited us in Vermont, boxy and carpeted and new, 1,000,000 times nicer than our flat back home, but dimly quiet without our friends crowded around the living room, chatting away the evening. She'd talk about how my assistant professor's salary barely covered our rent. And she'd talk about working the early morning shift as a janitor at the college, mopping the same mahogany classrooms I lectured in, emptying the garbage can full of my students' crumpled napkins and paper coffee cups. Katka came from a long line of intellectuals. She was the one who was supposed to be offered a professorship in America. Her father had been shipped to a psychiatric prison for writing his own anti-government pieces when Katka was still a baby, and an enormous part of her childhood was watching her mother devote herself to getting him out. I remember Katka back in university and trying to impress her with my big ideas, only to realize the political books I was reading for the first time were ones she had already dissected and gleaned an understanding of years ago. There was something so romantic, almost exciting, about watching this brawny college girl reduce my ideas to a lumpy pile of porridge, making me feel not like a rising star at the university, but what I knew I really was deep down, a skinny kid from a family of uneducated dairy farmers. A big part of me had always believed I was destined to ride her coattails. I could see how hard the move to Vermont was on her. I could see it in the way she closed into herself when I dragged her to cocktail hour at the provost's house, the way even meeting me for a quick lunch before class made her anxious. The woman who had once stood outside party headquarters chanting STB equals just Gestapo was suddenly afraid to order at the campus sandwich shop because she didn't understand the menu. At this point, Katka would say the transition would have been difficult no matter what, but that I certainly didn't help. She'd say even when I was home, I wasn't really there. At the dinner table, or lifting a crying Daniela from her crib, I always seemed to be silently working on another essay. how I ducked into my study at every possible moment, how birthdays and anniversaries slipped into a murky, irretrievable place in my mind, but how I never seemed to forget the dates of Saul Sandalowski's dinner parties. And she would be right. But those dinners, Saul with his floppy, wheat-colored hair and shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, clamping a hand on my shoulder as he led me inside. His stone house on Seminary Road, so mazy and grand I always got lost looking for the bathroom. I was the honored guest, the man with the stories scholars and journalists and philanthropists wanted to hear. And so, over glasses of wine, I told him about the two STB officials waiting outside the political science department. Tomasz Novak, one had said, and I had said, "Why do you need to know?" And they dragged me into a black service car. It was late April, sunny but cold, and as we pulled away from the curb, I saw people outside the university, staring away or feigning conversation so they wouldn't be witnesses. In the headquarters, the officials led me down a long hallway into a windowless room with white walls and a steel desk with a green-eyed, round-faced man behind it. He calmly asked me to name the other writers involved in the journal. I refused. He asked again. He asked again and again, so many times that the hours began to blur and I couldn't tell if we'd entered the next day. All over Czechoslovakia, writers were breaking down and naming names. But did they really believe sleep deprivation would crack a father with a newborn, I joked to Saul's guests? Though I remembered the moment I'd started to cry, sitting in that hard-backed chair as I recalled stories of people brought in for questioning and never heard from again. The lights were bright, and one of the chair legs was shorter than the others, so I felt as if I was perpetually sliding off. And every time I nodded into sleep, the man who would slam his desk drawer shut, jolting me awake. But I continued to refuse. And when one of Saul's guests would ask where that bravery came from, as someone always did, I'd tell them we all had a reserve for when we needed it most. I believed that, though sometimes I wondered if I could ever depend on it again. When I was finally released, word spread and I became famous among other writers. They called me the quietest man. Yet as I circled Saul's living room, with Brubeck on the stereo and little salmon crudités being passed around, I understood I could finally name the names of the chronicle writers without consequence. So I told them about Katka Novak, my brave, brilliant wife who unfortunately wasn't here this evening because we couldn't find a sitter, I lied, when in truth she rarely wanted to leave the apartment anymore. My wife who, for the 4 days I remained quiet in the interrogation room, was anything but. With a newborn on her hip, she led rallies outside the university, marching through the streets and up to a podium in Wenceslas Square. She spoke with such force that she persuaded an American reporter to write a piece about me. So while people with less evidence against them were jailed, enough support came through that my family and I were given emergency clearance. And when I described Katka to Saul's guests, it was like she was back up on the podium, drawing so large a crowd that children climbed the trees to glimpse her. But then Saul's dinners would end, and I'd tiptoe into our silent apartment and find the new Katka in bed with the lights off. "You awake?" I'd whisper, a little drunk off the wine as I ran a finger along her pale, freckled arm. "No," she'd say, rolling over. And it was only hours later as the sun came up and I walked her through campus that she'd unlock the lecture hall with her chunky ring of janitor's keys and say, "Imagine eating alone while I was at dinner parties." That's how Katka was. She'd pick up a conversation I thought had ended eons ago without ever reintroducing the topic. "I'm not saying we go home. I know we can't," she'd say, "but maybe New York. Somewhere," she said, "with people like us. Somewhere that didn't feel like the edge of the earth." But before I could answer, the first students of the day would breeze past us as if we were no more significant than the chalkboards and long wooden desks that filled the room. Katka continued to push the idea of moving to New York, but things were changing for me at work, and fast. Katka said I was being selfish. I told her I was working hard for all of us. She said I owed it to our daughter to be home more, that if I didn't consider her feelings, she'd leave me and take Daniela to stay with her cousin in Queens. I begged her not to, but there was a secret part of me that wanted her to go, that longed to be free from the responsibility of my family. I wasn't ready to leave Vermont, not when I felt my life there opening up, wider and wider. Of course, I didn't really expect a woman with no money and next to no English to leave. And it was only when I made the first custody drive down the Taconic that it actually felt real. Of course, I didn't expect Katka to find steady enough work cleaning houses in New York, or that she'd parlay it into her own business with a dozen employees. And of course, I didn't expect that 3 years after Katka left, communism would collapse and the work I dedicated my life to would be done. That the dinner discussions at Saul Sandalowski's would suddenly revolve around Bosnia, and that a young female Serb would become Saul's newest honored guest. And I certainly didn't expect that same woman to win tenure over me. That my 30s and 40s would be about mastering the delicate, tricky dance of pleading for adjunct work up and down the East Coast, Albany, Durham, Burlington, and now, for the past 2 years, in Harpswick, Maine, which, if Katka had thought of Vermont as the edge of the earth, would have made her feel she'd fallen off completely. Thanks. So thanks. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about today is family history and the way that those elements worked their way into the writing of the book. And Judy mentioned this essay, and I have to say the most exciting thing. So I had wanted to talk about this woman from Antopol that I had met at this friend of a friend's party in Haifa, and this was back in 2000. I had just graduated college and I was living in Israel. And then I walked in here to give a talk, and I met a man and David and Kitty, who I just met 20 minutes ago, and their family is from the village of Antopol, and they brought the book. So that was really exciting. So it was just like I wanted to cry. I felt so emotional right before this talk. So that's just incredible. It's just so incredible. And so thank you so much for bringing this book, and there aren't that many of them. Yeah. So I would like to talk a bit about this book, and as Judy had said, so I had met this woman, and I was at this friend of a friend's party in Haifa. I think the only person I knew at the party was the friend who'd invited me, so I had no one to talk to at this party, and this is how this interaction happened. I was standing by the dessert table, like just kind of eating desserts and having no one to talk to and feeling embarrassed. And then I went into the kitchen to have something to do, and I met this elderly woman who Judy mentioned in her introduction. We started chatting, and I think it was about 30 seconds of me trying to chat with her in Hebrew when she was like, "Where are you from?" And I said, "America." And she said, No, where are you from? "California." "No, where are you from?" We got to Antopol, and I found out that this woman was from Antopol, and it was genuinely one of the most extraordinary moments of my life. I come from a big family of storytellers, and so growing up, I had just relished these tales of all of these times before I was born. So I had heard about this, battered VW Bug that my parents had lived in before I was born, and then when I was little, it was nicknamed Blue after the Joni Mitchell album that I just remember on repeat my entire childhood. And and before that, the generation before that, my grandfather had been really active in the Communist Party, and I had heard so many stories from my mom and her siblings about those, dinner time visits from the FBI. Always right at dinner time. Always these two men in these stiff brown suits asking my grandfather if he had a moment to talk. Those were the stories that I had heard so many times. And then as Judy mentioned, I had also heard stories about my namesake, my great-grandmother Molly, who had come from this village of Antopol and who had basically had to leave her entire family behind, went to work in this sweatshop that was run by another cousin of ours, and she didn't make enough money to send her family over. But besides that, I just knew nothing about where Molly was from, and I knew nothing about this place, and it was just this kind of dark place that no one in my family talked about, and even the funniest relatives just kind of didn't know how to twist that into a good anecdote, and so nobody talked about it. And I had spent all of these years trying to summon an image of this place or that time, and I didn't know how. And so meeting that woman and finding that book was incredibly life-changing. And it's funny because the book is I'm only here for the term, so I don't have the book with me. So the fact that the book is here while I'm talking about it is pretty mind-blowing. And so I want to describe it a little bit. And you can, so as Judy talked about, it's a Yisker book. It's a memorial book that, it's a memorial book basically from all of these villages that were basically destroyed during the Holocaust. And so there are these books that are published by former residents or by aid societies as remembrances of communities and of people lost during the Holocaust. And it's this enormous, I think, really carefully and beautifully put together book. It's you can just feel the careful bindings and the thickness of the pages that people just put so much effort into creating this book. And one of the things that I loved the most about this book and that captured me the most were the accounts of the village's partisan fighters, which, teenagers who escaped the ghettos during World War II and joined these underground resistance movements in the forests surrounding Antopol. And growing up in the States, I had known very, very little about the partisans. But in Israel, I was, living there that year and working with teenagers, and I was learning that it was basically an essential part of the school curricula. And that was so intriguing to me that in Israel, they weren't teaching the Holocaust just as a story about victims and about innocent lambs being led to the slaughter, but rather that among these tales of the camps and the ghettos that they were teaching in the schools, there existed this other narrative that was being taught, which was the story of Jews fighting back. And to the Russian and the Chechen kids that I was working with that year at the absorption center, the Lithuanian poet Abba Kovner, who was a partisan fighter who went on to live in Israel, was considered a national treasure to them, and they were reading his poems in class. And growing up in the States, I had never heard of Abba Kovner. And for so many years, I had just wondered about all of these people from this, the past, all of the people who had stayed in Antopol and all of the friends and the neighbors and the relatives that Molly had left behind. And I did really feel that suddenly finding this book, it was as if I finally got access to these stories and into these voices. And I became obsessed with this book. I carted it around with me everywhere that year. It was really the year that I first started, kind of planting the early seeds, the early seeds of what would become this book, and and really drawing on my family history, whether they were the McCarthy era stories or the liberalism of the 70s. And I suddenly felt like I sort of had the access and the authority, I thought, to be able to write about this place and time as well. And it would be so perfect to tell all of you that I read all of these books and that it was incredibly helpful and illuminating for me. But the truth is that I found this bookstore in Tel Aviv that wasn't far from where I worked, and it was on Allenby Street, and it was behind this electronics repair shop and the Sephardic luncheonette, and I would go in there every couple days. It had this seemingly endless resource of Jewish history books in English. And the owner, I would always stop and chat with him. And I remember he was kind of large and balding, and his clothes were so rumpled that he kind of resembled an overstuffed drawer. And I remember he looked at me one day and he said, "I have never met anyone with a more depressing taste in books." And I thought, it's true, okay. But I have to say, and you too? Judy and I share that. So I had this depressing taste in books, and I just read and read and read everything that I could find about partisan life sort of all around that area. And it would be so perfect to report now to all of you that I had finished that whole stack of books that I got from that bookstore on Allenby Street with this really sharp and nuanced picture of Antopol, and that I finally felt like I had the knowledge and the authority to write about this faraway place in time. And then on weekends, I went and hung out with this woman in Haifa, and we drank tea and bonded and swapped stories and became friends. But the truth is that I never heard from her again. And I think that to her, I was the American girl who showed up at a party, cornered her by the sink and asked way too many questions, which is fine, and that's true. But I will say that everything had just felt so clear when I was reading that Antopol book, because it's so enormous and it's so detailed and it contains such a myriad of voices that I had really wanted with everything to believe that it was this pillar of fact. But the more books that I read and the more research that I did, the more my doubts grew, because suddenly putting all these books together, all of these inconsistencies started to come out. So I had read a dozen books on partisan life near Antopol, and still I had questions. In fact, I had more questions. So one person would recount subsisting solely on blackberries and mushrooms in the encampment they set up in the forest. Another person, living in the same forest during the same chilly autumn and brutal winter, described the weekly village raids, pillaging bread from peasants' kitchens, livestock from their farms, potatoes and turnips and onions from their gardens, all cooked over a fire in their makeshift outdoor kitchen. One writer mentioned this plethora of weapons that he and his partisan brigade stole from peasants in nearby villages. Another person, again living in the exact same forest during the exact same time, described the one snub-nosed revolver that the brigade had to gingerly pass around and the spent bullets that they had to pry from the forest floor to reuse again and again because that was all they had. And, I have to say that I've never believed that it's a fiction writer's job to create an exact replica of the past. Like, I deeply, deeply believe that it is not. I don't think that we should be trying to create a diorama for for a reader to step into. I think we have Civil War reenactments. I think we have historical home tours, and it doesn't need to happen in books, and it definitely doesn't need to happen in fiction. But I think that it is my responsibility to learn everything about the world that I'm writing about and to try really hard to become an expert, because I think that in order to truly understand understand my characters and to try to make them feel real and empathetic to my readers, I have to understand the politics and the history that influenced who they are and influenced their decisions. And that's the only way that I know how to make the imagined feel authentic, which is what I'm trying to do as a writer. And the question is, what if these details don't add up? And what if, despite months or years of research, I remain uncertain as to where the truth actually resides? And how else can I glean facts about a village when there's no one left in that village to answer my questions? I've always loved this idea that memory isn't a precise duplicate of the original, that it's not. Instead, it's this continuing act of creation. And whenever I think about memory in that way, I envision all of these partisans from Belarus who chose to relive some of the darkest moments in their lives for the sake of a book. And I can't believe that it crossed any of their minds that one day, more than 70 years after the war ended and they'd left the woods, that an American writer would be comparing details from one book against another, neurotically worrying whether blackberries really grew rampant in the forest in the autumn of 1942. Like, I can't believe it. But rather, I imagine that by writing these books, or by allowing biographers to write about them or people to interview them, that they were attempting to make sense out of a harrowing history and trying to kind of control it and shape it, through language and through telling the story. And I think that as a writer, it is important to focus on the blackberries and on these other kind of details. But where these facts don't jibe, no matter how deeply I research, no matter how many books I read and archives I visit, I think my job as a fiction writer is not to impose order on a host of disparate and often contradictory facts, but rather to adhere to the deeper emotional truth of my characters. So whether they ate blackberries or whether they ate turnips, and whether they carried pistols, rifles, or sticks, they were living, hunted in a freezing forest with no anchor to the lives that they had once known. And what does that feel like? And what does that do to a person, both there in the forest and for the lucky ones when they trudged out, filthy, exhausted, and bone thin? What does that do to someone? And I have to say that I've come to this realization over and over and over. It has hit me at some point in every single story I've written, all the stories that made it into the book and all the stories that hopefully will never make it anywhere. And it's the advice that I would give to anyone who's writing anything kind of based in real life, which is nail down the facts to the best of your ability and then mine them for truth. And once you've done that, you've earned the license to make the rest up, and that's why they call it fiction. So I'll end just with a flash fiction piece that I wrote that was inspired by all of this research, and this piece ultimately became a longer story in the collection. Maybe you've heard this story. 1942, and a winter so cold my grandfather watched hot soup freeze in a bowl. He was living in the forest with other teenagers outside Antopol. Maybe you heard about the weapons he robbed from nearby peasants. Maybe you heard about the sticks of dynamite he set along military rail routes, waiting for them to spark and explode. Maybe you heard about the bear he chased out of the woods. When I was a kid, we'd spend summers in Tel Aviv, squeezed into his sweaty kitchen, picking at a bowl of grapes while my mother fixed us lunch. He had a deep tan and a big voice, white hair parted drastically to one side. He liked to sit around in his undershirt and sandals and tell stories. Stories I half believed but still repeated to my friends like gospel, of secret missions and near escapes. And always, at some point, he and my father would argue. My mother and I could never predict what set them off. It was like watching a barometer rise from 0 to 80. And suddenly it was as if the two of them had taken up all the oxygen in the apartment. And my grandfather would stomp out to the patio, and my father would say to us, "He's always been like this. The war's over 70 years and still he's in it. He hates everything." And my mother would say, "Nachum, calm down." And my father would say, "I am calm." And then she'd give me the look, and I'd pack up our uneaten lunch and take my grandfather around the block to the park. "I worked 40 years at the shoe store," he'd say to me. "I turned it into a franchise. You tell your father that's looking forward, not back. And I don't hate everything." He didn't walk the streets so much as patrol them. "I love my apartment. I love the heat. I love you. I love this park," he says, gesturing wildly. I watch Filipino women push the very young and the very old down the path. Watch two teenagers, barefooted in Bedouin pants, chase a frisbee. "I love this bench," he says. "It's our bench." But then he starts popping his knuckles like he does when he's antsy, and I know this can't go on. But I don't love that squirrel, he blurts. It's nothing but a rat with a fancy tail. And those kids, they're lazy at Frisbee. Why aren't they in school? Give me that bag, he says. And when I do, he lays out our lunch, boiled eggs and pita and fruit salad, and says, I don't love the berries at Super Sol. They're mush. I ate better ones that year in the forest, no joke. All winter it was potatoes, potatoes, potatoes. But come summer, blackberries were everywhere. See, that's me being positive. Give me a napkin. Give me a fork. Give me that stick over there, he says. It's a good one. You see this? Long and so straight that at night they might mistake it for a rifle. Hold it up like this, and no one can ever hurt you. Thanks.